Hello, and welcome to this podcast brought to you by Argus Media, a leading independent provider of energy and commodity pricing information. Sustainable aviation fuel oil has emerged as the airline's main route towards decarbonization, and an industry which has been reliant on fossil fuel must now learn about technology pathways, feedstocks, regulation, and new ways of pricing and accounting aviation fuels. At the same time, the market is facing uncertainty because of the shortage of fuels and high prices. Today, we will touch upon some of these topics with Neste, a company who has placed itself as a key player within the biofuels and the SAF space. And to discuss these topics today, we have here with us Jonathan Booth, Vice President of Renewable Aviation at Neste. Hello, good afternoon, Jonathan. How are you?
Yes, all well, very good, thank you. I am delighted to be here to talk about one of these very hot topics that I'm sure is going to be with us for quite a while.
Fantastic. Hopefully, and thank you, and thank you, Jonathan, for coming. Jonathan, I'm gonna start the podcast asking you what are Neste's plans to build SAF production capacity in the short and in the long term, if you can speak about it, and could you as well please touch upon what technology pathway or pathways will those facilities be using to produce biofuels and SAF?
Yes, Neste is by origin a traditional refiner and marketing company in the Nordic region, especially in Finland. Over 10 years ago, over the last 10, 15 years, has developed real know-how and expertise in dealing with difficult oil products and converting them into finished products for use in road transportation and other sectors, and has used this know-how and expertise to now really become a leader and have as its primary purpose the development of circular solutions and renewable products so that we can truly reduce emissions and address the climate change challenges that we as a society globally are facing. So really now Neste has got some crude oil, fossil oil refining, but now is predominantly a company that's focused on using renewable or waste feedstocks and recycling them to use the recycled carbon in our ecosystem rather than bringing more carbon into our ecosystem. So recycling and circular solutions for renewable products in road transportation, aviation fuel, and indeed also in the chemical sector. And so we've really decided we want to now, and we see a huge opportunity and a need to develop renewable or sustainable aviation fuels for the aviation sector, which is one of the hardest to abate sectors alongside marine and heavy goods vehicles in the transportation sector. So we're now producing some 3.5 million tons of renewable fuels, and we plan by the end of next year to grow that to 5.5 million tons. But we're really making a big step forward in terms of our SAF production from 100,000 tons worth of capacity this year to 1.5 million tons worth of production capacity by the end of 2023, in particular as a result of investments in Singapore and in Rotterdam. This is using the most commercially developed production technology called HEFA, hydrotreated esters and fatty acids, and uses waste materials, oil-based waste materials and animal fats, and use cooking oil. But we are also looking at future production pathways and feedstocks. I think now the whole industry recognizes that SAF needs to be sustainable aviation fuel needs to be a key enabler to decarbonising aviation, and HEFA production technology and raw materials is what's available today. But we absolutely need to look at municipal solid wastes, at alcohol to jet using ethanol, at also then the so-called power to liquid technology, where we extract carbon from industrial emissions or from the air and combine it with hydrogen that we've extracted from water using renewable power to create a hydrocarbon liquid fuel that is effectively recycling carbon from emissions or from the air, rather than from biomass. So these are the production technologies and feedstocks that we envisage developing over the next 10 to 15 years that will build upon the biomass that we're using as a feedstock in the so-called heifer production technology today. So we really believe that this is not about one solution. It's about developing different production technologies and different and then being able to leverage different feedstocks so that we can truly bring SAF to become the primary source of a liquid fuel used by aviation, alongside then new aircraft technologies such as hydrogen or electric. And so Neste, in summary, will be producing or have production capacity of about 1.5 million tons by the end of next year. And indeed, only last week we announced a further investment in Rotterdam, which will take us to 2.2 million tons worth of capacity. And just to put that into context, 1.5 million tons worth of production capacity represents roughly 3% of total European demand. And the mandate that's being proposed for 2025 for SAF is 2%. Now, obviously, not all of our production will come to Europe. Some of it will go into North America, California, and indeed into the Asian region and elsewhere. But it just puts it into context. We've got a huge growth challenge ahead of us, but Neste is certainly investing to meet that growth challenge that the industry faces.
Thank you, Jonathan. I like actually that you mentioned in this order municipal solid waste, alcohol to jet, and power liquid. Can we take that this is a natural timeline in this order where probably alcohol to jet there's a lot of talk about alcohol to jet volumes coming into play some point in the later part of this decade. Is that sort of correct? Do you agree with that sort of thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. The first commercial volumes, but then really we've got to have a very significant acceleration in the 2030s, beyond heifer production technology.
All right. Thank you, Jonathan. And impressive those numbers. That production capacity is impressive. Pretty much in Neste alone, we'll be able pretty much to meet the mandate as it stands today. So that's perfect. Talking about mandates. So the European Union, you already touched upon it. The European Union Fit for 55 mandate proposes to have physical SAF delivered at all airports which experience certain minimum yearly traffic. For this, there will be a period, of course, of transition that allows time to build the logistics to supply the SAF to those airports and even to connect some of those airports. Could you elaborate for people not familiarized maybe with the logistics, how SAF is today transported, delivered to the airports, and what will be the impact on logistics of the mandate in the future?
Yeah, so SAF currently is approved for use in aircraft as a result of the global ASTM approval process, where the aircraft manufacturers and engine manufacturers go into a very detailed research to ensure safety and performance. And it's approved up to a 50% blend with fossil jet fuel. So one can't currently put neat or pure SAF into aircraft. So it has to be blended first with fossil jet fuel. But once it is blended, it's then effectively approved as a jet fuel and can go into the existing logistics infrastructure, supply chain infrastructure, both towards the airfields, airports, as well as actually at the airports. That's the beauty of this solution compared with maybe other kinds of propulsion technologies which require, such as electric or hydrogen cells, which require a completely new aircraft and new supply chain infrastructure. This is a fuel that is a drop-in fuel that can go into the established supply infrastructure pre and on airfield. The real extra work is simply to ensure that we've got well-located blending facilities using, hopefully to a large degree existing tankage, but converting it for this blending operation. And it can then be moved by vessel, by pipeline, by rail, or by road to the airports. And in effect, it will be moved in exactly the same way as fossil jet fuel is moved today. So in that respect, there are no extra costs once it's blended. But I do agree that to start with, it's easier to get it into the larger locations. I mean, if one has to have a dedicated truck for the SAF delivery to a small regional airport that's currently supplied by trucks anyway, it's just easier to only start doing that once a certain large level of demand is required for it. I mean, you don't want to be moving to every individual airport 1% of all the fuel requirements in a separate truck. It does make sense to start with to focus on the larger locations where we've got more volume, larger volumes to push through. And I think the EU is talking about a transition period before it requires all airports to take a certain percentage as SAF. And then, in other regions of the world at the moment, there's no mandate as such. Maybe it'll come. It's more around incentives, and so indeed, their suppliers and airlines can elect to really put it into the larger locations. But the real key is here: it doesn't require new investment in infrastructure.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. I think this is clear. There's always some questions about how do we blend SAF, how do we put it in the airport, and actually it's very simple. It's actually a qualified jet fuel is meeting the specs, and it can be blended up to 50%. That's yep.
Maybe one thing just to add. It's best to do the blending pre-airfield. So at the moment, it's not permitted by the industry standards. It's not permitted to do the blending at the airport. That's not because it couldn't be done there, but it's just that typically at the airport, you have a more limited number of tanks. And what you don't want is for any kind of blending or specification problems to occur at the airport, because then what may happen is that all of a sudden a tank has to be taken out of service, and you may then not be able to supply the aircraft for a period of time. So it's much better to do it pre-airfield rather than and to be frank, centralize it and get the economies of scale rather than doing it in every airport. But in essence, the blending is not rocket science. You've just got to make sure that you're combining the right kind of fossil jet fuel with the neat or pure SAF to ensure that you meet the specification requirement for it to be certified as jet fuel.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. Is clear. Moving a little bit into prices or pricing. The airlines they've been under constraint. I mean, due to the very high jet fuel prices and the very high jet crack and the lack, obviously, the lack of product. There's been lack of product, shortage of products in some particular locations during this year. And do you think that this situation is having or has had an impact, or it will have an impact in the procurement plans of SAF of the airlines for the rest of this year?
Well, yeah, it's certainly been unprecedented times. The not just in terms of the level of the current fossil jet fuel price, but also the volatility day to day. And that's certainly, following on from a difficult COVID period, it's added further stresses and financial strains to the airline industry as they seek to recover. So it's clearly not helping. But what it hasn't changed, nevertheless, is the desire and the commitment of the industry to move on this pathway of sustainability and emission reduction and to take on the use of SAF. And it's certainly also not undermined policymakers, whether in Europe or indeed in the US, where they're talking about incentive schemes to help encourage the use of SAF. And indeed, right now, with the higher fossil jet fuel price, the premium that one has to pay for SAF, or SAF is no longer 3 to 5 times the price of fossil jet fuel. It's more in the 2 to 3 times range, depending on which market you're in. But the key here is to have the supportive policies that ensure a level playing field for airlines, and secondly also to work on how we can make sure that the use of SAF is supported by the end customers, and we're increasingly seeing interest from corporate travel, but also from air freight shippers as part of their commitments or their value proposition vis-a-vis their end customers, to reduce emissions to actually be willing to pay for the incremental cost. So this is a key. We all need to work together, the airlines, but equally we as Neste and other players in this market need to find ways by which we can make it easy for the end customers to pay for the incremental cost, so that it's not simply another hit to the margin of the airlines, because to be frank, they haven't got the financial strength to take that. It's got to be passed through ultimately. Yeah. So in summary, I would say the high and very volatile fossil jet fuel prices at the moment aren't helping, but equally then they're not undermining the commitment to take on SAF.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Yes, definitely. You mentioned policy. Policy obviously is probably needed to fill the price gap somehow between the price of SAF and the price of fossil jet fuel. Do you think that looking forward, those two products, there is a sort of small debate about whether the price of both should converge as SAF becomes much more viable and there's a major number of production facilities and producer, or it will be always the price of the jet fuel running behind because there will be always new, we mentioned at the very beginning of the podcast, new feedstocks and new technology pathways that aren't related to crude oil. Therefore, they will make their way into the market, and there will be always an additional, very much high independent SAF price versus fossil jet. You see conversion, or you see that they may follow their own different fundamentals and
So they fundamentally, fossil jet fuel has a different set of cost drivers to the production cost of SAF, whether it's from biomass waste feedstocks, or whether it's from municipal waste, or whether it's from the capturing of carbon from the atmosphere and conversion of or creation of green hydrogen. There are different cost drivers, but over the long term, I do believe there'll be a convergence. But that doesn't necessarily mean that SAF is going to get cheaper. It might mean, because each of these production technologies also has different raw material costs, but also different capital costs, and typically, especially if you look at, for example, the power to liquid technology that I'm sure will come to bear from the 2030 onwards. The capital cost is very significant, not just in the production of the liquid fuel, but also in the renewable power generation that's required in order to be able to create the green hydrogen and capture the carbon. Different cost drivers, but I believe over time, for sure, as we develop the technology readiness level, commercially scale up and have the learning benefits, we will become more efficient. But on the other side of the coin, we don't know what the fossil jet fuel prices will look like in the future. But also what we need to do, and this is why I believe there will be a convergence in price, is we need to factor in the cost of the emissions that's currently not built into the fossil jet fuel price. And what you're beginning to start to see is a carbon price being layered on as a result of policy, whether it's the ETS or some other scheme, CORSIA or otherwise. So gradually what you will see is the price, if you don't use SAF, of fossil jet fuel will not simply be the fossil jet fuel price, but it'll actually be the fossil jet fuel price plus some form of a carbon fee that you're having to pay for. And so I think that alongside then the economies of scale and learning benefits that we'll get from developing a SAF supply industry, that's why over time there'll be a convergence. There have been a number of reports done recently, one by Eurocontrol, which has tried to articulate what are the extra costs versus doing nothing, and actually they diminish over time because of this carbon cost that we will have to pay for as an industry.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, it's great. It's great that you mentioned there's as well a big debate in the aviation industry, and the market is definitely committed to better understand how to price or to offset the cost of not polluting as much as using jet fuel. So we wonder whether companies like Neste are able to model in their supply demand forecast in the projection of prices the impact of airlines that consume SAF and will avoid emitting those volumes of carbon, so that they will have those carbon offsets, and they will as well potentially able to sell their credits, the SAF credits, and get incentivized by potentially by regulation or by other mechanisms imposed by governments. Does Neste project or include that calculation in the future? Is Neste already looking at how to price these elements into the price of SAF, or it will?
Well, certainly, when we're making investment decisions to grow the availability of SAF, and when we're looking at the feedstock costs, we're also then on the other side of the coin looking at what we think the evolution of policy will be, because that's whether it's ETS, carbon pricing, whether it's mandates and penalties if you don't comply with the supply mandates, or whether it's other forms of incentive like the blender's tax credit that's being talked about in the US at the moment. We absolutely are trying to form a view as to what that will mean in terms of a likely market price, and whether we think that's going to be sufficient for us to be able to get a return on the investments in new production capacity, because that's what at the end of the day this industry needs. It's about not just Neste but lots of other competitor suppliers or producers making the call to invest, and so we're all taking a view on what we think the likely market price will be as a result of policies, and also, as I mentioned earlier, what we think customers will be willing to pay in order to meet their own ESG, environmental and carbon reduction targets. So many companies now are already targeting, well, airlines alone are targeting 10% usage of SAF by 2030, and you've got corporates and other companies who may be even targeting 30% or more to get to net zero by 2040 or so. It's forming a view as to what the revenue streams will look like, but this is far from being a perfect science. There's an awful lot of uncertainties here. It does require a bit of courage and a belief that what you're trying to do as a company is going to get remunerated without necessarily having all the certainty you would normally expect in a multi-billion-dollar investment decision. Because at the end of the day, this industry is not going to have to invest billions. It's going to be hundreds of billions to bring on the hundreds of plants that we're going to need over the next 20, 30 years to enable SAF to be not 1 or 2 or 5% of all the jet fuel demand, but actually 50, 60% or more in by 2040, 2050.
Thank you, Jonathan. Definitely only for the brave. And with this, we conclude our podcast, and we thank you, Jonathan, very much for sharing your knowledge, and we thank you all for tuning into this podcast. And for more information on Argus Global Refined Products coverage, please visit argusmedia.com/oil-products. Thank you, Jonathan, again. And
pleasure.
Stay safe and see you next time. Thank you.
Yeah. Great, thanks.